Hi, welcome to the bathtub without sound effects, without musical intro. We don't have a whiteboard. We do have a parakeet that's gone wild. It's gone dingo, and it's gone dingo in the office, in the bathtub, and she doesn't want to come down, so I'm not going to make her. We're going to have another brief one today because I've been reading a lot of pointless. I've been reading not pointless books. I've been reading pointlessly. I read good books pointlessly. That's the whole premise of this show, is to read good books but for no reason whatsoever. And I've managed to find some time recently, even though I was doing a lot of work. I had to write some essays and write my stupid stories. And one of the things I've been doing over the past few months really is I've been fiddling around reading old books I used to read and writers I've always been interested in. And this week I thought we'd talk on this episode, we talk about New Worlds. Anyone who was a science fiction buff in the 60s and 70s probably remembers New Worlds, because they were kind of the trendy, arty, kind of weird. They were called in the New Wave. Basically, they were just kind of very literary writers writing science fiction or weird-like stuff. The term speculative fiction came out of this. They throw the word speculative fiction around all the time, but it kind of came to explain these stories. And New Worlds was edited by the great Michael Moorcock. I've only met Michael a few times and corresponded with him a bit, and he was a great editor, really fun writer. He definitely deserves to be in the All Bathtub Hall of Fame really soon. But for now, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the writers that came out of New Worlds. Some of our favorites, like Tom Dish, was in there. Tom Dish did some of his best stuff. J.G. Ballard, who had been an established writer by that time, and Brian Aldiss were kind of the writers who'd been around before New Worlds was trending, and they started to write some of their strangest, weirdest, and most interesting stuff. Some great stuff, both by Ballard and Aldiss. And then a lot of young writers came along. I want to talk a little bit today about two young writers who kind of started with New Worlds and then went on to have pretty good careers. One is Christopher Priest. We talked about him. We did a sui generis about Christopher Priest about a year or two ago. And the other one we haven't really covered is Michael Harrison, M. John Harrison, and they both kind of were roughly the same age. They both kind of published some of their early work in New Worlds and had different associations with the magazines. They were also kind of interesting because they started publishing. This was Christopher Priest's first novel, was called INDOCTRINAIRE, and M. John Harrison's first novel was called The Committed Men, and I forget what they came out. They came out like in the 60s, I guess, I want to say. The Harrison book was 71, and this is 1970. So they're kind of interesting writers. They really had kind of complementary careers. They're very different writers, but let's talk about some of the similarities. They both started with New Worlds. They were both literary writers. I don't know what that means really, but they obviously came into it as young men who knew a science fiction, but they also knew lots of other fiction and literature. Harrison has a lot of interest in kind of lit-crit theory. You'll see that coming up and down in his work all the time. And Priest's interest seemed to be in history and in a lot of literary fiction. So they both were very well read. They kind of come into New Worlds, and they start off just being published as science fiction writers. They both established themselves in that field. They're both extremely strange, unusual writers. So a lot of people who like science fiction, who wanted to go read space opera and Star Wars type books, were not going to be happy with either of these writers. I mean, you think of Ballard as a pretty cynical, he's cynical, and he doesn't have a very good idea of the future of the human race. These are pretty dark writers. They have a very, very dark vision of the future, and that's similar about them. Most of their books tend to end on pretty dark. They wrap you up in a pretty dark landscape by the time any of their novels are finished. So they had fairly good careers. They started off in science fiction. They kind of established fairly good literary swing. So they started to be recognized outside of SF at a time when they should have been. They both started to win fairly literary, non-science fiction type awards. I don't think either of them won the awards in science fiction. They should have. Priest won some important He won an award for the Prestige, I think, which was normally for literary fiction. And Harrison has just recently won some big shot award in in England. I don't know what it is. I just sort of seen bits about it, and it's for a non-SF book of his. He wrote a couple of books without science fiction elements in it. One of which was called Climbers, which was about Harrison's passion for rock climbing. I knew Mike fit when he was doing the rock climbing. I couldn't hold it. I literally could not grip one of the rocks. And Priest has had a good career. His stuff has been almost all his novels have been pretty speculative. There's been a speculative element in all the books, and he's slowly established a kind of outside of the genre reputation. So they both did that. Having said that, they're two extremely different novelists, and I like them both for totally different reasons. It's kind of fun reading them together because they're so different. Other than the really hugely dark sense of humanity and its future. Let's face it, they turned out to be that attitude towards the human race is not far off the mark. They both write fairly dark books. I read this a few months ago and I forgot a lot of it. I always have trouble remembering Priest's plots. Priest's stories are much more complex plots than a Harrison one, I would say. This is a very simplistic difference. But they set you up. They're extremely involving narratives. And the prose is not, it doesn't sparkle. I don't mean this in a bad way. It's very narrative prose. It really draws you into the story quite a bit. He tends to stay point of view on one character, which I think is what makes these very complicated novels work. He starts off in a kind of, you feel like in a vague sort of nebulous place. And I think he also withholds information in the opening chapters of his books. I would say that. He's one of the only writers I could say he kind of withholds information, which normally would bother me, and I think it works in his stuff. For example, in this one, it starts off, we meet some scientist who's working in Antarctica or somewhere in the North Pole or the South Pole, I forget now, and he's working on something top secret. I don't think he tells us what it is. And he is informed that there's been a place somewhere, I can't remember where it is now, in the Amazon rainforest or something, where a bubble is opened up that lets you travel into the future, like 50, 100 years or something. Anyway, you start off, and when you start off a Priest novel, I honestly feel this is true most of his books, you're a little uncertain where you are, and you're uncertain about the character you're with, but you're in that person's head for a long time, and you go into a tunnel where you really don't know what's going on entirely. If you read The Prestige about the two magicians who were battling one another, there's information in that you're not given at the very beginning and throughout the book that you start to realize in the course of the novel about the two magicians. You can sort of guess if you look, but you can't be sure. So that's the best I can do as far as describing it. You go into this, and then you're subjected to the kind of experience of the central point of view in the Indoctrinaire, which is he's put into this kind of prison camp, this futuristic prison camp with these weird traps and weird. He's put through this kind of grueling interrogation every day, and it's basically a psychological torture of this man. And as we proceed through the book, we start to understand what his involvement is in the future and what he did in the past that caused the future. But you're mainly absorbed because of these kind of Kafkaesque traps that this man is finding his way through. There's one weird section where he's trying to find his way through this, literally a trap, a maze for human beings. Anyway, the book goes on, and as you finally find your way, there's often in Priest books a big shift about halfway through the book. I don't want to describe what it is. I wouldn't be able to do a good job. But he does make a shift somewhere where you actually have to, you've just barely started to understand what's going on in the first half, and in the second half something else is happening. And you find your way through to the end. And I don't want to describe more than that, except that by the time you find out what's going on, and the central character finds out what's going on, which is when you find out, it's a pretty dark space. It's a dark place to end up. I'm not going to do as good a job describing the committed men, except to say that plot-wise, I have trouble following sometimes Harrison's plots, particularly in these early books. It's set in a futuristic world. It reminds me a lot of the Mad Max books. It's all set on freeway overpasses, and it's sort of it's a sort of future of England that you saw written a lot about in the 60s and the 70s, when after the war the country just looked probably like a mess. And it's about this kind of futuristic world where there's been some war, probably a nuclear war. Everybody has cancers all over their faces. It is a really, really dark book. It's also prose-wise completely different from Priest, who kind of draws you in with it's not unadorned prose. It's sort of narrative prose is the best I can say. Whereas Harrison will write a scene in like 2 pages, which is almost narratively, sentence by sentence, kind of brilliant. He can write brilliant sentences. He has a great way of telling a story. But you have to pay attention to every sentence and what's happening in it. We meet a bunch of different characters, which I have the biggest trouble with some of Harrison's early books. There's a number of different characters in this book, and there is one youngish guy, I think it's Wendover, who's sort of the point of view, but you're so far back from him, it's kind of hard to tell where he is or what his vested interests in are. But the course of the book, it's about this kind of band of characters who come together. There are some really nightmarish scenes in this. It reminds me a lot of The Road Warrior, with some of those really nightmarish scenes, but even worse, even darker. One woman who loses her baby to this tribe of crazed mutants running around after this thing. And it is a really brilliant, dark, horrifying novel that's very funny. It also, one of the things, the last thing I would say that's kind of similar about both of these writers is they both you kind of see them looking at the Americans' adventures in Vietnam about that time and the horrors that were being reported every day. And they both have passages where you're going through these kind of war scenes, which really do feel like Apocalypse Now type scenes. So they do seem they have similar sensibilities, but extremely different types of narrative writers. I think these are both really good books. So I would, in many ways, put this up with most of the Priest novels. It's his first book. He's a young man, but I really enjoyed reading it. This is kind of brilliant in its way, too. And I don't know if I would say it's the first book to read of his, but it's certainly worth reading. And it's a really, really interesting, twisted, and narratively, again, Harrison's prose and the way he can set up a scene very quickly. And almost every sentence, almost every paragraph anyway, there's a sentence or two which he uses words in ways that just surprise you. I always like that type of writer, too. Okay, that's it. New Worlds, Mike Moorcock, future All Bathtub Hall of Famer. I'd kind of like to read through, if I live to be a million, I'd kind of like to read through both of these writers' works, particularly from this point on in their careers, because they read well together. Okay, stay safe, happy bathing. Don't let the mutants get you. Bye.